Strikes in the time of coronavirus. French unions threaten to walk off the job. They say now's the time to demand more rights and protection for their workers. But with the global economy struggling, will governments respond? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating. Lockdowns around the world have forced many businesses to fire staff and cut spending. Unions are now worried workers will lose hard-fought benefits. One of the biggest unions in France is calling for a national rail strike on Thursday. The CGT wants President Emmanuel Macron to guarantee workers' protections in his $120 billion stimulus package. It's meant to help companies recover after the pandemic, but some rival unions say now's not the time to strike. The Transport Secretary doesn't believe many people will join a planned rally in central Paris. France has banned public gatherings of more than 5,000 people.
Moi, j'ai du mal, je l'ai dit, à comprendre cette grève dans la mesure où nous venons.
As I told you, I really don't understand this strike. Just last week, we allocated $6 billion to the railway sector, which will come after recovering $40 billion in debt. We've implemented the capacity for rail transport to become a model of success in future decades. I know the stance, the ideology of the CGT union rail workers on this issue. I know perfectly what they're fighting for. What I'm struggling to understand is, at this moment right now, in a time of deep crisis for France, when the government is heavily supporting the railways, the deeper reasons for their strike.
The pandemic has led to job losses around the world. In France, 800,000 people are expected to become unemployed in the coming months. That's nearly 3% of the entire workforce. In Germany, the number of people out of work reached 3 million between June and August. While in Italy, half of the jobs lost in the pandemic were held by people under the age of 35. And globally, more than 1 in 6 people between 18 and 29 have stopped working since the beginning of the outbreak. Let's bring in our panel. In London, Julien Hoez, a European policy specialist and a member of French President Emmanuel Macron's party. And in Brussels, Petros Fassoulas, Secretary-General of the European Movement International, a civil society network promoting closer European integration. A warm welcome to you all. I'd like to begin with you, Julien Hoez, in London. Now, the unions are saying, is an opportunity for you guys to erode workers' rights. You're deliberately eroding workers' rights, and you're actually riding roughshod over years of French law.
Well, we've been hearing this since during the presidential elections in 2017, and this was one of the many reasons that people said they refused to vote for Emmanuel Macron, because he was the president of the rich, he was a Rothschild, and all of these issues. However, if we actually look at what's been happening in France, the French government has been incredibly generous, in the way that it has been supporting workers during this time of crisis. Let's not forget that France was one of the pioneers of what's the furlough schemes now are, and was the most generous in what it gave, to the point that it actually shamed other governments by association, such as the British government, into applying a furlough scheme and protecting its workers in the same way as the French did.
But why the CGT and CGT striking then? What's the point? Like, I mean, obviously they do have a legitimate grievances. They're worried that you're using COVID-19 as an excuse to basically get rid of a lot of people.
Well, having read the call to strike on the website and the things that were published recently by the CGT, what they've been saying is from a variety of different issues. So they want to make sure that the government prioritizes increasing the level of employment, which the French government is doing to the best of its ability. Employment increased by 0.4% in August and 9.1% in July. So the French government is doing what it can. Also, the prioritization of helping the CGT to manage its services, which the French government is always doing. And again, there were criticisms about the French handling of the SNCF, whereas the French government already took on 5 billion euros worth of debt from the SNCF very recently.
Let me bring in Petros Fassoulas in Brussels. Now, This is not just a French problem. This is a global problem when it comes to dealing with COVID-19 and the effect it's had on industrialization and the workplace. Is there a unified European solution to this?
The European Union has adopted a plethora of measures over the past few months, but also in previous years as well, to address some of the more systemic structural problems with the European economy. But in the context of the pandemic, the health pandemic that we have been facing, there's been significant investment from the side of the EU to support people, help them keep their jobs, and assist them financially in case that is not possible. The programs that the EU is funding have supported about 40 million workers around the EU. There's been an investment in the tune of 90 billion in supporting employment over the last few months. But there's also a lot of investment going on to address the structural problems that I mentioned earlier, efforts to move to more digitalization and make Europe a player in the new digital domain that we are all experiencing, not least at the moment. And for that reason, I think it's imperative that European member states work together, because the problems our societies are facing, the economic problems that they're facing are common across the board. Digitalization, automation, artificial intelligence, all those new elements that are changing very much the nature of work can only be dealt with at the European level collectively.
But when you're looking at somewhere like Italy, for example, where the vast majority of people who have been affected, Petros, have been under the age of 35, you're looking at a generation of people that may not be able to get back to the levels of earning that they had before. Is that still, is a stimulus package enough to sort a country like Italy out, for example?
Again, there is a long-standing problem with youth unemployment in places like Italy, Greece, Spain, and elsewhere. And that's where I think, again, the importance of investing in structural solutions is huge. Training people, supporting entrepreneurs, helping SMEs, who are the main employers on the European continent, get through the crisis and grow. And I think that's where the really important thing when it comes to the measures that have been put in place over the last few years, and especially in the last few months. The European Union is trying to be targeted in its assistance of young people and other vulnerable economic groups that have suffered the most because of the transition, the new digital industrial revolution that we're experiencing. And the intention from the European Union is to make sure that European citizens are better equipped to go after the new jobs, but also create new jobs.
Julien Hoez in London, it's a $1.6 billion, $120 billion aid program. It's a stimulus program. $6 billion of that are actually allocated to the railway industry itself. So we are talking a massive amount of money here. What are the strings?
Well, the strings are, for the time being, well, particularly in member states such as France, what is being done is now air transport services, for example, general low-cost flights, are being told that in France in particular, that they're not allowed to run flights that are less of two, well, they're not allowed to run flights on routes where there are journeys that can be taken by train by 2 hours or less, which is causing problems for certain sectors within the industry, such as the low-cost transport flights and the industry and the airlines that rely on these to make a profit and run their businesses. However, for the time being, there's always going to be some sort of unforeseen consequences of many decisions. We don't know what that's going to be. Across Europe, particularly in Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President's speech this morning at the State of the EU, there's been a big push towards digitalization, which is going to have an impact on all these industries as well, and may make them more efficient and may make them easier to use for the average traveler, user, or company. But we're going to have to wait and see what happens.
Let's now bring in Nayla, a member of the French CGT union, who joins us from Paris. Nayla, this is a $120 billion stimulus package, $6 billion of which are allocated to the railways. So why on earth are you going out on strike?
Well, we're not complaining about the amount of money allocated. We're complaining about how this money will be used. The government announced that 100 billion will be used for employment, but in the reality, there are a lot of financial aids and and also tax incentives for companies, but there's no security to guarantee any job. So the problem is in France that we have the unemployment that increased very much after this COVID. We're talking about 22% of increase, and especially for young people under 25 years old that have an increase of 29% of employment. And at the same time, so many jobs are lost, salaries are freezed, employees lost also a lot of vacation days because it's a measure of the government until the end of the year. But in the meantime, dividends were distributed to shareholders. So we consider that companies do not take any social, ethical, and responsibility in this crisis.
So what you're saying effectively, Nayla, is that the French government is actually bailing out the bosses and not the workers.
Well, they're helping companies so that companies still be alive, but on the same time, they do not have any guarantee that the workers will still keep their jobs. So yes, we need to have more control, more guarantee for the jobs, which is not the case today.
Julien Hoez in London, why can't you make those guarantees?
Well, myself personally, I cannot make these guarantees, but the reality of the situation is that
you're a member of the
every
party
single...
that can make the guarantees. So let's
course.
say that.
But what is happening now is, for example, the French finance minister said that the funding going towards these companies had to be used to support the employment. And the reality is that while shareholders may be getting paid dividends, which is not necessarily something that I may personally agree with, the issue at hand is that if these shareholders aren't in place, sadly, many companies aren't able to operate, and we need these companies to operate in France across the French sectors and industries, and as well as to help in the European recovery. These businesses need to be kept running, because if these companies aren't kept running, then there are no jobs. And if there are no jobs, then unemployment skyrockets further. And we should really be very cognizant of the fact that, again, France had one of the most generous furlough programs in the world, emulated to some respect by the USA and the UK when they realized they couldn't do anything differently. And when we actually look at the reality of the situation, we're still not out of this crisis. So the government is doing absolutely everything that it can to ensure that all companies and industries related are being kept running, that furlough programs are being kept running for another 2 years, it was announced recently, and that temporary wage subsidies, training subsidies, and unemployment support is being kept running as well. It may not be the best for employees to have to miss out on some holiday days as a result of that, but personally, as a French citizen, I think it's a price worth paying to make sure that the country keeps running.
Nayla, Glaise, do you think it's a price worth paying?
Well, you know, the crisis has a lot of effects on everything, on people, on employment, on the public service as well. And what was announced is, if you see it on the paper, is very optimistic and very good. But in reality, there's a lot of things missing. And don't forget, this money is our money, is the people's money. So it's the workers' money, it's our taxation. And we should have our word to say how it should be used as well. So let's start. What about the public service? During this crisis, we realized how important the public service can be, and especially in health, social security, and all the social protection, and then they realized that it's really very essential to have efficient public service. Some announcements were made for hospitals, but it's been many years that all the governments that were succeeded, their main interest was to reduce the public investment, and especially for schools and medical care and all the social security. And now we realize that it's a big mistake. So it's very difficult to cope with all these cuts during many years. But so this is why we are saying that it's not enough. What they're doing is not enough, because even today, after the the peak of the crisis in the hospitals, they cannot take care of all the problems they have. Even today, they have a lot of people coming, and all the doctors and workers there are having a lot of overtime. So we know there are some problems. They try to do things, but yeah, it's been so many years that I've been doing the opposite of what should be done. And what they're doing now is certainly not enough.
Petros Fassoulas in Brussels. On the one hand, you have Julien Hoez, who says he's very proud of the French government's response to this. He says it's something that other countries should be emulating. Then we have Nayla Glaise in Paris saying, well, actually, it's not enough. What do you think? Is this a model that other countries should follow?
I think there is an inherent tension across the world, and that manifests itself in Europe too. We are seeing a complete transformation of the global economy and the European economy, and we have seen the production of big winners and equally big losers. The gaps are increasing, society is becoming more unequal, and that is generating social instability and political instability, as we've seen from the emergence of totalitarian and authoritarian movements and political parties. The imperative here is to work together to find a new compromise, a new consensus for the new economy that the 21st century has ushered before us. The nature of work is changing. The way our societies are operating has dramatically shifted, and COVID has just put us in front of our responsibilities in a very stark way. Finding the balance between workers' rights and assisting businesses is very difficult indeed. But we need a much more holistic conversation and debate, one that cannot happen at the national level, one that needs to happen at the European level, together with all the partners. We are a very rich continent. We need to invest in the right things, be it digital or otherwise. We need to make sure that our environment is protected adequately, because without it, our economy will suffer without the possibility of recovery. And these are the things that need to take place, as I said, at the European level, because they affect all of us in the same way. And the quicker we find common solutions, the easier it will be to address all those individual issues that we're facing today.
But Petros, what you're saying effectively is that COVID-19 has accelerated this new way of working, which was always going to come. But here, it's now in front of us right now. We're talking about things like remote working. We're talking about the way we actually get to the office, if we go to the office, indeed, at all. What about the strikes? What about the strikes that the CGT is proposing? Is that therefore helpful or unhelpful when it comes to facing this new world?
It's interesting because today the President of the European Commission, the EU's executive, made a reference to the tensions, the social tensions that we're facing, and the strike that they're generating. It's clear that people feel marginalized, they feel left behind, they're angry, and they're trying to find a way to voice that feeling. Be it through demonstrations, joining movements, voting for extreme parties. And I think it's important that we listen to this. Our policymakers, first and foremost, are elected politicians at the national and the European level, because the sense of frustration felt across society and across Europe is real, and it's not going to go away just by wishing so. So yes, people who are demonstrating, people who are voting for extreme parties, people who are taking to the streets, have legitimate concerns that policymakers need to listen to and act upon them. I am encouraged because from what I see here in Brussels, from policymakers at the European level, but also national policymakers, I think there is a real realization that we need to change the way we run our economy. And that needs to happen as soon as possible. But as I mentioned earlier, it won't happen overnight, and it will not depend on individual measures. We need a holistic debate and structural reforms and sacrifices and constructive contribution by all parties, both the social partners, civil society, politicians, and business, of course.
Nayla Glaise, are you behaving responsibly by calling for a strike? It's particularly, as we've just heard, there is a new challenge when it comes to the way we work and COVID-19.
Yeah, well, we would prefer not to call for strike, to be honest. But the problem in France is that the social dialogue is completely broken with the government. For instance, I'll give you an example. We should be today discussing a new negotiation on telework, because most of the people, and especially my trade union, I represent professionals and managers in my trade union, and 80% of them are teleworking today. And then we asked for negotiation on telework, and there's no negotiation at all. Let's talk about the retirement reform. Our government is using this, the capacity it has to block all the debates in General Assembly, block all the negotiation, and push for these laws in force using the 49.3. I don't know if you know what this, but this is a way to block all the discussions between the social partners and the government. So yeah, we would prefer not to strike. We would prefer to earn our salary as everyone, because I remind you that when you're on strike, you're not paid. But then if we have any other way to do it, we would prefer this. The problem is that our government is not is not listening to us, and there's no negotiations at all.
Julien Hoez, why isn't your government listening to the people?
Well, I mean, the government is listening to the people. It's why they've had multiple national conversations regarding multiple important issues. After the Gilets jaunes, beginning of the Gilets jaunes movement, Emmanuel Macron led multiple discussions with people across France, same thing regarding ecological policy. And quite honestly, the French government has done quite a lot to listen to the French people. But for example, in a move that was nakedly political because it didn't suit them, I remember when Edouard Philippe organized meetings of all union heads early last year regarding the Gilets jaunes crisis, and all of the union heads decided to walk out at one point because they weren't being given specifically what they needed to, and they refused to negotiate. Similarly, right now with the pension reforms, what's happened is that it's actually been delayed in terms of discussion because, quite honestly, the French government doesn't want to push through a reform project this way while there's a crisis happening, crisis that may not end until next year.
But then are you using the crisis to actually stop the reforms that you don't want?
No, the French government still wants pension reforms, and most of us believe that French pension reforms are a positive. I mean, I've looked through the entire project of law on the pension reforms, and personally, it's something that I agree with and many other people agree with. The issue is that it's more politically expedient to pretend that the government is trying to force through things undemocratically, because it's easier to rally people to what I think are incredibly irresponsible protests. For example, just yesterday, 7,852 new infections. On the 12th of September, it was 10,561. We're about to be in a situation where the economy may have to go into lockdown yet again if things can't get under control. And the problem is that when that happens, then there'll be even greater issues with employability, financing, and the like. And I would just like to go back again to what was being said about the not enough being done for the public services. Let's not forget that France gave health workers a pay rise worth 9 billion euros in total, each receiving around 183 euros. And that this was done according to the manifesto that was put forward in 2017, and that this was done following decades of neglect of health services and public services by both right-wing and left-wing parties. So
we are running out of time. We are running out of time, and I do want to come to Petros Fassoulas. Julien paints a very rosy picture of what's happened in France, suggesting that actually it's a model worth emulating. However, there are a number of different countries that are using COVID-19 as a way to crack down and erode workers' rights. Is that concerning you?
Certainly, and I think the European Union is built on the premise of social compromise, the one that protects the rights of workers. The EU has recently adopted a swathe of legislation, put together an authority to overlook the labour markets and oversee any kind of infringements in that regard. And I think in Europe we are We're proud of fashioning some of the more advanced social protections, and we should make sure that that remains the case in the future. We're not going to improve our competitiveness by reducing our rights. In fact, what we need to do is train our workers, upskill them, make sure that they are more efficient and more effective. We give them the tools, digital or otherwise, to perform their roles even better. And as far as I can tell, at least at the European level, there is no appetite to reduce the social protections that are currently enjoyed by workers across the continent.
I want to thank all our guests, Julien Hoez, Nayla, Glaise and Petros Fassoulas. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.